Hi, everybody. This is Nicole Gonzalez van Cleve in the Department of Sociology at Brown University. And I'm here with Professor Michael Kennedy. And we wanted to just send our well wishes to all our students who are scattered around the globe right now at such a difficult time. We wanted to capture some of the great sociology discussions that we're all having at this time due to the pandemic. And certainly issues of inequality have never been more present and more distilled than watching how our country in America, as well as across the globe, are really trying to cope with this unprecedented pandemic that we're facing right now. So I wanted to thank Professor Kennedy for joining me today. He's a professor of sociology and international and public affairs at Brown University, and throughout his career, he's addressed Eastern European social movements, national identifications, and systemic change. And for the last 15 years, he's also worked in the sociology of public knowledge, global transformations, cultural politics, and focusing most recently on social movements, universities, and solidarity within and across the nation. So Michael, it's a casual conversation, so I'll call you Michael. Thank you so much for talking to me. I couldn't think of a better person to really talk today about how your work is related to what we're facing during this COVID pandemic.
Well, Nicole, it's great to be with you, and of course with all of our students elsewhere. We do miss them, and in their absence, I recognize just how much I take inspiration from them for the work that I do. So I think my work is suffering for their absence, but this is one way for us to increase our connections. So, I've probably for decades, I've been trying to figure out how to call the different kinds of work that I do, martial arts sociology, superhero sociology, even occasionally. But I think knowledge cultural sociology is the best way for me to describe it, which is that domain where you think about under what conditions expertise is recognized and how it has changed. And of course, in this crisis, we think very much about different kinds of expertise, even knowledge abilities, about how to engage us. So unfortunately, this pandemic is terrible, but it is also a terrific opportunity for sociology to exercise its powers. Yeah. In fact, on Twitter, one of the things I'm astonished by is that there's so much sociology going on around the pandemic. In fact, there's a hashtag, people check out hashtag pandemic sociology. And if you're writing about it, please use the hashtag so we can capture some of the variety in it.
Mm-hmm. So how is the focus of pandemic sociology changing for you? So what has been your particular contribution to the hashtag as well as the movement?
Yeah, so I think you could say that my work is primarily in two arenas. On the one hand, I'm almost institutionally obliged to think about the global and transnational dimensions of the pandemic, because I'm the chair of an American Sociological Association section called Global and Transnational Sociology, hashtag GATT Sociology. This is our area. A pandemic is by definition global. Yeah. But it's really striking to think about how most of the sociology we see is always about the here and the now.
And that's usually a here and now that's very American as well.
Well, if it's American sociologists.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
if it's the French sociologists, they're talking about the French, the Polish, and so on, right? So, but there are people like Sasha White, who's at Johns Hopkins now, who has a very nice sort of global historical approach to pandemics. So there are exceptions, but most of us are talking about the here and now. And so the global and transnational emphasis is typically a corrective. When we're talking about inequalities, why are we always talking about them within communities or within nations? Why not across the world? Mm-hmm. When we're thinking about expertise, why are we thinking about American expertise rather than global expertise? Mm-hmm. When you think about policies around the COVID-19 crisis, you're often thinking across the world, comparing why is it that Taiwan is doing so much better than the United States? It's not just that it's an island, it has an epidemiologist in its government, right? So, and instead of ignoring expertise, they're actually mobilizing expertise. So on the one hand, I'm doing a lot of work on the global and transnational side. I just wrote an essay for our section's newsletter, trying to integrate all of the different work that's being done. But on the other part of my life is much more about engaged sociology. I began that more under a different name. I use the word critical sociology, but engaged scholarship, I think, is the term of preference here at Brown. So I've been thinking of it in those terms. And I think of it especially in terms of solidarity. Under what conditions and how do we recognize solidarity when we see it, especially now?
Well, I guess, how do we think about solidarity when at this time we're supposed to be distant from each other? There's something that's inherently troubling about this pandemic, which is, my own family, we were out in the, walking in the parks, and nature is somewhat a safe area. And, an older gentleman kind of came close to us, and there was this cringing of like, oh my gosh, like a fear of social life. And I just would love to hear how you think that's changing at this time, and then how do we capture it during this crisis?
Yeah. So this is where sociology really needs to step up. I mean, as a discipline, we've been thinking about solidarity from our birth, you could say. And especially since I'm so close to so many healthcare providers, I take their concerns seriously. They say, you've seen these posters, right? Show us solidarity, stay at home. Right. But when we're staying at home, we're invisible. So you don't quite see it. And of course, we want to have those public demonstrations, the Black Lives Matter or marches on behalf of introducing policies that change climate change. And all of these are examples of how we have in the past demonstrated solidarity. I have one former sociology student, Katie Cohen, who participated in the same engaged scholarship seminar you did last year. And I just was talking to her this morning about how she's a labor organizer in Lynn, Massachusetts. And I participated in a demonstration they had last summer challenging a developer's ignorance of union rights and fair housing. And so I talked to her this morning and I asked her, well, how are they pursuing this? And in fact, they're innovating like everyone else. So instead of being out there marching, they recently ringed this developer's construction site with people in cars honking. And so we can have these physical demonstrations of solidarity. But I think we do need to figure new ways to demonstrate solidarity, and not by being at home. We need to be somehow publicly engaged in a new way, and in spaces we're maybe not accustomed to.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our children participated in a birthday party. It was a birthday parade, which is the latest rage for children to do, because there's really no such thing as a birthday party in the traditional form. And it was so invigorating to just like be part of, leaning out of your car and ringing bells. And, it was interesting to see that, like, the children actually needed that so badly, that there's something so abnormal to all of us, right? So we can think of solidarity as a key component of mobilization, but just if you think about it as a key component of development, just being a kid, being able to be near each other. And, and again, you saw some kids almost getting in other people's spaces accidentally because they hadn't seen people in so long that, so this is a real issue. It's not just to me, the mobilization part, but it's also just like a key component of living, right?
One of my friends here in the neighborhood did come down with COVID-19. And she had just come back from Portugal, and she wrote about it. I'm blanking on the article's name right now, but she wrote about it. And, one of the things that she experienced was that there was real solidarity in the community, because when somebody gets sick and when the rest of your household has to be quarantined,
right,
you do rely on people to bring you food. You do rely on people to bring you medicines and so on. So we are experiencing all sorts of solidarity, all sorts of community building. And it's not only the solidarity among those taking care of one another, there's also an emerging solidarity, which is worrying, among people who want to oppose the stay-at-home orders. There's a kind of solidarity movement among people who carry guns, who say, you know, we got to end the lockdown because we got to open up the economy. So solidarity is a virtue, but it can also be mobilized in ways that destroy the possibilities of health.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about when I've, since coming to Brown here, Engaged Scholarship has been such a wonderful, just wonderful movement on campus here. And I know a lot of our students are really, excited to be engaged, but many of them are a little disappointed about the uncertainty of, what does Engaged Scholarship look like during COVID? So can you talk to us a little bit about, especially for our students, so how has COVID changed what could be known as Engaged Scholarship, and how can our students think about it at this time?
Yeah. So many of the students last year that I was working with were especially interested in civic education. And they did this in a variety of ways. They went to the local schools and worked and tutored children in the local schools. They also worked on it at a programmatic level. I mean, in fact, another person who visited our seminar, Jen Wood, is the head of the Rhode Island Center for Justice. And a lot of our students work with her and with that organization, and they became quite famous because they challenged our state. They sued our state because they said the education provided in Rhode Island is not adequate to assuring that children become well enough educated to be effective participants in the electoral process. So that was, quite important to the sense of Engaged Scholarship last year. And I talked to Jen Wood not long ago, and I asked her about that project, and they said, well, that's still important, but what's way more important right now for the Rhode Island Center for Justice is the threat of eviction with job losses, with economic strains. Landlords are predisposed to try to evict their apartments if they're not being paid. And so one of the things that Jennifer is focusing on especially is how to protect tenants. Now, that doesn't require that we go out on the streets. That requires that we move the legal system. And that's one of the things that she's doing. And that's the kind of thing that our students can be involved in, even when they're maintaining physical distancing.
Yeah, I think, to me, I used to do a court watching program. I've done court watching, and that really has been, in person. It basically is defined by the ability to go to those field sites, go sit in the courts, listen to proceedings. And now, I just got an email about the fact that courts have been moved online. And so there is even this possibility of actually doing court watching, but zooming in, literally like forcing these courts, forcing them to be accountable in this new way. And so, to me, it's time for innovation. I think that's the exciting thing for students is that, engagement may not look like the way it did for now, I'll say for now, but I think those people and students that are willing to innovate, and usually youth are really good at innovation, they're more agile. This is a great time for that type of engagement, meaning it's a terrible time, but it's a great time for those who can innovate and to help for the greater good. Yeah.
And it's not only, one of the things that was always this misconception, I would say, about Engaged Scholarship. In the past, it used to be this almost white patrician thing, go out and help the, lesser the less privileged or something like that. It's not that way anymore. And in fact, one of the things that is changing is for us to think about what is the arena in which scholarship takes place. And frankly, one of the places where we need Engaged Scholarship now is within higher education. Students are themselves, by virtue of thinking about what their alternatives are, engaged in a kind of Engaged Scholarship. They are having to think about, well, how is it that I can approximate the learning that I had when my peers were around me when I'm doing all of this remote learning? We're all in that business together. We're also all in the business of thinking about our graduate students in particular, I mean, one of the things that they noted is in the start, we were thinking here at Brown, first and foremost about undergraduate students and about our faculty, not first and foremost about graduate students.
Right.
That changed. And this is one of the other things that I think we have to recognize. We need to innovate, but we also need to give people a space to change, a space to recognize, because there's so much going on at once. So one of the things that I'm impressed by, you know, this is a shout out to our department. I think our department has done a really quite impressive job of figuring a way, and this is, you know, Prab Kahal and I wrote an article for American Sociological Association's Footnotes. It should be coming out soon, in which we talked about how graduate education is faring. This is very difficult times for graduate education.
Yeah.
And, you know, while I don't want to, and I can't really comment on the university writ large, one of the things I can say about the department is that instead of treating solidarity, going back to that theme, instead of treating solidarity only as a resource, it was also treated as a goal. How do we keep together? And that's one thing I would say engaged scholarship is about. Don't just take what administrators, don't just take what bosses say as the goal of an organization. Think about what the goal is for you and how do you work with other people in realizing it. And one of the things in our department that we need to realize, and we did better at during crisis than we typically do, is how is it that we can generate solidarity around all of the members of our community?
Well, you know, it's interesting because, I mean, how many times I've seen people in the hallways, and again, just being new to Brown, I only had one semester under my belt and I was meeting people, but it was the work of the graduate students initiating a trivia night. And it really forced us to all be present and have fun and laugh together and, you know, smack talk. I was, you know, joking with my grad students, I'm coming back to, you know, to beat you. And they would, you know, I zoomed in late. They said, "What, are you scared, professor? You're not here." And, you know, we've just been having fun in spite of these circumstances. And you know, I've been thinking about their health and wellness. And it was interesting because I've gotten a few emails from the graduate students checking in on me. And there is this something that's, you know, there's something really beautiful about that, right? Is that is a type of solidarity emerging from a crisis. And maybe it wouldn't have been there otherwise had we not gone through this. And maybe we'll be different on the other side of it.
So this raises a really interesting question for me. Typically sociological. One of my favorite expressions that someone taught me years ago, contrasting sociology educations and business school educations. Business schools always ask a question that they can answer. Sociologists almost always ask a question they can't answer.
Right.
And here's one that I really think is, you know, quite important. It's really relatively easy to generate solidarity in a community that knows one another through trivia nights or other things. It's relatively easy to generate solidarity within an institution like Brown when you're thinking about how is it that we can make the transition to online learning and remain fiscally solvent and equitable in our distribution of benefits. And that's relatively easy. But one of the greatest challenges, you know, since I work in higher education, one of the greatest challenges before us is to think about how we can have solidarity in higher education writ large, because the differences between the Ivy League and public universities and community colleges are so great that we need to be able to think beyond our own institution, beyond our own position, to formulate those agendas that might bring us all together in a more equitable fashion. And that only becomes greater when you think globally too, because most of our associations are national. And if we look to our associations for that articulation of the common interest, that's fine, but they're mostly national organizations. So I work with, there's an organization called Open Societies Foundations, and they have a higher education support program now joined with education in general. So that is a truly global organization. I've been working with them to think about the place of education writ large in this time of pandemic and crisis. And there are no simple answers, but what is clear is that we can't ask the conventional questions anymore. We need to think well outside the box, and in fact, probably outside the frame.
Right. Well, then that leads me to one final question, but one that I keep returning to, thinking about. I wrote a piece in Context Magazine, kind of revisiting an old question, which is, what does it mean to live for sociology today? That is, what is our vocation at this time? And is there something about sociology in this moment that needs to evolve to to what we're facing during this pandemic?
Yeah. Thank you, Nicole. I mean, I think that's really a good way to move to our conclusion, because sociology is born in crisis. I mean, it is reborn in crisis. It is defined by crisis. And why? Sociology, in contrast to all the other disciplines, thinks about every institution of society equally. Economists can talk about markets, political scientists can talk about the state. We talk about those things, but we also talk about civil society. We also talk about the public sphere. We also talk about the private sphere. We're thinking about all of these things together. And I think one of the things that makes me very proud of our organization, or our discipline, at least its potentials, is that we're never asking the question that's most comfortable. We're never asking the question that the most powerful always want us to focus on. We're thinking about the questions that are nightmares, that are risks. In fact, in my introductory sociology class, one of the options for the final was to talk about alternative futures. Mm. In fact, we have quite dystopian alternative futures before us. I don't think we have any utopian ones, but we certainly have opportunities to make it better. And so sociologists may be talking about what's the most likely outcome from this crisis. Frankly, I'm very sad to say the most likely outcome is a far more authoritarian, surveillance-prone, even violent society, not only in America, but across the world. But I couldn't imagine a better discipline in which to invest than sociology, because we are asking the kinds of questions that will make that less likely. We are asking the questions that might help us create a society that is more just, more equal, and frankly, more free to ask the question we need to ask. So, you know, I missed out, and this is where I conclude. I thought I missed out because I'm of the generation that just missed Rebellion Year 58. Here in 2020, I'm sad to say, and I'm happy to say, there's no better time to be a sociologist.
Absolutely. And so thank you so much for chatting with me today. And to our students, that is true. There is no better time to be a sociologist. And the hope that I leave with is thinking of my students and training them to be the types of people that will go on to innovate, create change, create solutions that are equitable and just. And that gives me hope. So wherever you are watching, to all our students, we miss you here at Maxey Hall and at Brown University, and thank you so much. Knock it off. Everyone stay at home and be safe.